Welcome to the Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat Program with Rabbi Shalom Rosner. Tzurba is a revolutionary halacha sefer which guides you through over 300 topics in Jewish law in a unique signature style. In this weekly series specifically, Rabbi Shalom Rosner learns through the Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat volumes, helping us all master the Halachot of Shabbat in just 2 years. Tzurba volumes are available for purchase worldwide on Amazon. And to learn more about Tzurba, or for those in Eretz Yisrael looking to purchase volumes, please head over to tzurbaolami.com. For more information, see the description below. And now, Rabbi Shalom Rosner.
Okay, here we go with Bishul, our second shiur regarding Inyani Bishul. We start a new volume in the Tzurba Mirabanan, the Lax family edition of the volumes. This volume is dedicated to Nishmas Yakir Hexter and David Schwartz, who were Moser Nefesh and gave their lives al Kiddush Hashem, defending Am Yisrael here in Medina Yisrael, and the Neshama Shav and Aliyah through all the learning and the inspiration that takes place through this volume number 18 of the Tzurba series. And we are continue with Hilchos Bishul b'Shabbos. We spoke about direct sources of heat the last time. We spoke about fire, and we spoke about Toldos Eish and Toldos Shemesh, and today we discuss the secondary sources of heat, where we will discuss in this year Kli Rishon, Iri Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, Iri Kli Sheni, Kli Shlishi. Along the way, we'll also discuss Davar Gush and a couple of other issues, Magus, other very important Lamaisa issues relating to Bishul b'Shabbos. Let's get right into it. Right, we know cooking in fire on Shabbos in a pot that's on the fire, that is Bishul b'Shabbos. That is a Kli Rishon. What's the definition of a Kli Rishon? A first Kli, a Kli that is on the fire, a Kli Rishon. If that pot is taken off the fire, that's called a Kli Rishon. That's off the fire, but it's still a Kli Rishon. Anything that was cooked directly on the fire is called a Kli Rishon. And the Mishnah tells us in Masechah Shabbos, in source number 1, we're on page 23. If I have a pot that was removed, still boiling from the fire, lo yitin l'tocha tavlin, you cannot put spices into it that were not cooked. Remember? So, meaning what? Even if it's not on the fire anymore, it could still be subject to Bishul D'Oraisa. It doesn't have to be. We spoke about last time, I think, about the cold water going into the dud on top. Which could be an issue, but here, putting it into a pot that's not on the fire on Shabbos, it's still Bishul D'Oraisa. But you could put it into a different pot, what we would call a Kli Sheni. What's the difference between a Kli Rishon and a Kli Sheni? So if you look in the Yerushalmi, the language of the Yerushalmi in the third paragraph of Shabbos, in source number 2, sounds like it's a din d'Rabbanan, a chilik d'Rabbanan, meaning mi d'Oraisa, there shouldn't be a chilik. The language of Rabbi Yonah in the Yerushalmi. Kan v'kan, ein ayat sholetisbo, ela asu harchaka l'kli rishon, lo asu harchaka l'kli sheni. And the Ramban gets from that, the Rabbanan of Avodah Zarah daf ayin dalid, that it's an issur d'Rabbanan to cook in a pot that once it's off the fire, and it is cooled off. No difference fundamentally between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni. That is not generally what we hold. We seem to hold that even on a D'Oraisa level, there is a chilik, and if somebody cooks in a pot that was off the fire that is still hot, so that is an Isser D'Oraisa. That's Bishul D'Oraisa. That's what the Rashba says. In Shabbos Daf Mem, which is the sugya of Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni, the Rashba says towards the end of that piece, in source number 4, anything that comes in that was cooked before Shabbos, you're allowed to cook on Shabbos. That was the Mishnah that we mentioned previously. Ein bishul achar bishul. Klomar, afilu b'kli rishon. Even in a kli rishon, you could put it once it was cooked. V'yavagav the toldos ha'or ka'or v'hamavashol b'chayev chatos k'mavashol eish mamish. Even though actual cooking in it, in a kli rishon that's removed, chayev chatos, if it's a shogeg. So therefore, we assume that cooking in a Kli Rishon, even shehusar me'al ha'esh, but if it's still yad soledisbo, if it's still boiling hot, that could be subject to Bishul D'Oraisa. On the Shulchan Aruch Paskins this way in Shin Yud Ches. Remember, Shin Yud Ches is the siman about Bishul b'Shabbos. Shin Yud Ches Tes, source number 5, Kli Rishon, Pirish, HaKli shemishtamish bo ha'esh. The Kli Rishon, meaning the Kli that was on the fire. Afilu la'acher sheviru me'al ha'esh, even after you've taken it off, mivashel. Let's say I have a burning hot pot of soup, and I took it off the fire, and what do I want to put in it? I want to put in, let's say, baked croutons. Baked of those bread croutons that were baked. That's a problem. Because we learned already, Bishul, yes, Bishul Acharafia. right? And therefore, at least l'chadchila, it's a problem. If you put in the croutons, regular soup nuts, the yellow ones, so those are deep fried and named bishul bishul by yavish for sure. And if you're going to put it not in the pot, but if you're going to move it from the pot, you can put it into the bowl. That we'll learn about kli shlishi. That would also be okay according to many poskim. But putting it in the pot, we're talking about a kli rishon. That's the first part of the discussion. Says the Shulchan Aruch, aser kozman sheyatzo ledisbo. Obviously, only as long as it's still burning hot. Once it is cooled off, so then it's not a problem anymore. Says the Mishnah Berurah, as we just explained, afilu b'kli rishon eino mevashal. And Rav Simcha Budim Cohen here in the Shabbos kitchen, it's quoted. Give some examples. When Minani adds seasoning to a pot of hot soup, even after the pot has been removed from the blech. If somebody's going to add spices or seasoning that has not been cooked yet, so that can be subject to bishul daraisa, biblical bishul, even after it has been taken off the fire. Putting a little cold water in. Let's say I want to cool off the soup for someone who doesn't want it so hot. You can't cool it. You can't put an ice cube in. Putting a couple of ice cubes into the burning hot soup. The kli rishon, no, that's cooking the ice cubes, and that would be a problem. Fine. That's Kli Rishon, and Kli Rishon Shehu Sarmei Ala Eish. What about Kli Sheni? So the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Mem has 4 words. Kli Sheni Eino Mevashel. A Kli Sheni does not cook. You can't cook anything in a Kli Sheni. That's not the definition of cooking. Why is that? That is a big discussion. Why is that a Kli Sheni won't be Mevashel? So Tosfos, a lot has been written about this. Tosfos, let's see the Tosfos. Tosfos Shabbos Daf Mem on base. Source number 8. Tema, Maishna Kli Sheni mi Kli Rishon. What's the difference? You could have a Kli Sheni that's hotter than a Kli Rishon. Right? You could have a Kli Rishon that's been taken off the fire and it's still Yad Sol Edisbo, but it's not boiling hot. Or you could have a Kli Rishon, right after you take it off, you pour it into a Kli Sheni, and the Kli Sheni is even hotter. So what's the difference? Why is Kli Rishon Mavashal, Kli Sheni ain't Mavashal? The Yatzoledes, afilu Kli Sheni nami. If it's a Yatzoledes, then even a Kli Sheni should be a problem. The Ena Yatzoledes, and if it's not Yatzoledes, afilu Kli Rishon nami ain't Mavashal. Then even a Kli Rishon shouldn't be a problem. So what is the chilik between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni? V'yesh Lomar says Tosfos. Lefisha Kli Rishon mitoch sha'amad halaor. The Kli Rishon, since it was on the fire, dofnosav chamin. Since it was on the fire, Tosfos says, its walls are hot. Dofnosav chamin machzik chomos man meruba. And it contains and retains the heat a long time. Lakach nasu bo shiur. Because machi yatso ledisbo aser. That's why, as long as yatso ledisbo, it sounds like according to Tosfos, it's in the heating mode. And it's going in the heating direction. And it retains the heat. Avo kli sheni avagav yatso ledisbo mutter. Shein dofnosav chamin v'holechu miskarer. The Kli Sheni, it's going in a cooling direction because it was never on the heat source, and therefore that's why it's allowed. Either way, Tosfos gives a svara. A lot has been written on it. There's an Ar Sameach. If you want to look at Rameir Simcha, also has a little more formal definitions. He connects this in Hilchot Shabbos to the sugyas of kocho and koach kocho. It's too far removed from the heat source, so it's not so much in terms of temperature. But once it gets to a Kli Sheni, it's too far to connect this to your action, to call this bishul in the source of heat, which is the fire, and therefore it is mutter. Either way, that's the Gemara. Kli Sheni is not mevashel, because defanos mekaros. We'll get back to Kli Sheni. There are exceptions to the rule, that things that cook even in a Kli Sheni, but based on Tosfos says it's the walls of the Kli Sheni that make a difference. So there are a number of points to make. Number one is a big sugya known as davar gush. Davar Gush, you have it there on page 28. Davar Gush. It starts off in Yeredeya, and the question is, does it go to Hilchot Shabbos? The Isser V'Heter, one of the Rishonim tell us that if I have a burning hot piece of meat and I cut it with a milchik knife, that's going to be a problem. What do you mean? The piece of meat is on my plate. The plate is not a Kli Rishon. Why is that a problem? Says the Isser V'Heter Ha'aruch. No, because the meat is a davar gush. It's a solid item. And solid items retain the heat different than, let's say, liquids, for sure, which would apply. That's where you have the svar of Tosfos of the funnus makaros. The walls are cooling it off. You have to buy a liquid. But by a solid piece of meat, it retains the heat. Says the Isser V'Heter, source number 9. Basa roseach sheyasol edisbo shenachtach besakin shel chalav. You have a piece of meat that was cut with a milchik knife. O shehu ben yomo mitashmish roseach o besakin shel shari isurim, or it was cut other isurim. Agav duchat sakina bolei abakulo is considered a treif knife. V'lo dami l'kli sheni b'davar yavesh. Why? Leka defanos hamakaros. there are no cooling off walls, and therefore, says the Isra V'Heter, there would be a problem in Yoredei and Hilchas Kashrus. The Marshal extends this in the Yam Shel Shlomo, maybe not only a solid mamish, but even if you have, let's say, a rice or burgal that is all crushed together, as we'll see later, it has to be a gush, it has to be a unit. It's just granule and all over the plate. That's not holding anything in. But if it's a gush, if it's a solid piece, the Yam Shel Shlomo includes that too. A piece of meat, a piece of fish. That is the chumrah of davar gush. The Ramah in Yoredeya says we don't even accept this in Yoredeya. Says the Darkei Moshe. Aval Mekfar munach b'kli sheni cham. If it's already in a kli sheni, Aval bishayaso let us bo eno mavliya kamoshar kli sheni o davar av. No, all the cases of cutting the piece of meat that the Yoredeya talks about, that's all in a kli rishon. If it's in a kli sheni, b'kvi meko to logara davar shu gush bi davar lach. I don't think there's a difference, says the Ramah in the Darkei Moshe in his commentary on the Torah. So it's machlokas haposkim in Yoredeya whether davar gush replaces kli rishon. Who do we paskin like? Can that be brought over? What do we paskin like in Hilchas Yoredeya? And can that be brought over to Hilchas Shabbos? So the Maggid Avram is l'chumra. The Maggid Avram holds like the Marshal. The Maggid Avram in Orach Chaim Shin Yud Ches says v'chein kasva post can be Yoredeya. The davar shu gush afilu b'kli sheni mevashel v'kosh against sli. So the Maggid Avram is machmir. The Chavos Das says no. There's a difference between absorption and cooking. Absorption, davar gush, is hot enough to absorb, to be maflitu boleya. Says the Chavos Das. The Chavos Das is the Nesivus. The Nesivus' commentary in Yoredeya. Rabbi Yaakov Milisa, one of the prolific achronim, such an important seforim. The Nesivus is his most famous sefer, the Nesivus HaMishpat, which is, he argues much with the Ksos HaChoshen. The Nesivus is on Choshen Mishpat. The Chavos Das is on Yoredeya. The Beis Yaakov is on Meseches Ksubis. The Torah's Gittin is on Meseches Gittin. A lot of writings the Nesivus has. The Makar Chaim on Hilchas Pesach. Says the Nesivus here in the Chavos Das in source 13. Nero delinian Bishul de enu yachol avashel. Ra kli rishon. Sheish lo defanos machamamos. Only kli rishon. Aval shar dvarim. Chamin. Af sheish lem din kli rishon. Kagon davar gush l'marshal enam avashel. It could absorb, it could transfer taste, but it cannot cook. Da'af de'en lo dvanos bakaros, en lo dvanos hamachamamos. And halachos, so machlokas haposkim. Machlokas haposkim in Yoredeya. Machlokas in Orach Chaim, whether it is brought over. The Mishnah Berurah says one should be machmer l'chadchila. The Mishnah Berurah quotes the Magen Avram and many others also l'chadchila. The Shmiras Shabbos and Pnei Halacha. Rav Avadia is mekel kedarka b'kodesh quoting svek sveika imsak. Maybe the halacha is like the Ramah in Yoredeya, and even if the halacha is like the Marshal in Yoredeya, maybe the halacha is like the Chavos Das in Hilchos Shabbos. So svek sveika lakula. But if one wants to be machmir, so one has to know if somebody has a hot piece on his, a whole gush of cholent that's still burning hot on the plate. So one should be careful not to put the salad, nearby, because that could cook the salad or the coleslaw. One needs a mechitza, we like to say in our house. You need a mechitza between the cholent and the coleslaw. There are coolers of Shlomo Zalman writes that you don't really want the coleslaw to be cooked, and maybe it's lo nichale and misasek and mekalkel. But l'chadchila, definitely, it seems like one should, enough poskim say that one should be machmer l'chadchila to assume davar gush cooks for Hilchos Shabbos. Ribiat in source 15 quotes some other Lamaisa cases. One may not sprinkle diced onion, garlic, celery, or any previously uncooked spices and seasoning directly onto a hot davar gush. Right. The question is, what about ketchup? We spoke last time in the last year about ketchup. Machlokas Rav Moshe and Rav Shlomo Zalman whether ketchup is called a solid or a liquid. Rav Moshe assumed it was a liquid, and Rav Shlomo Zalman felt it was a solid. But in front of you, you have in source 16, Rav Moshe writes, even according to me, that I say ketchup is a liquid. Could you put it on a hamburger, a hot hamburger, a davar gush? As I'll be mekel there, says Rav Moshe. Because even it's a couple of chumras. First of all, davar gush is a chumrah. Second of all, ein bishal achar bishul bilach is a chumrah. Third of all, I'm not sure if this is a solid or a liquid. So Rav Moshe says, the Rishon litin ketchup al basar roseach shenitan l'kli sheni. Right, that was, you put it in a kli sheni as mutter. Davim nachmer gam shtei chumras. So even if you want to say two chumras that are real based on suffix, but it's still in this case where the chumrah of bishul bishul balach, as we discussed last time, maker a din ein bishul bishul even balach. Even balach, like the Rambam holds. So we're machmir by davar lach, but that's a chumrah ba'alma, or Moshe says to put all of these chumras together. Davar gush, and in a sheni, and ein bishul balach, or yesh bishul balach, so he doesn't think that all these go together. But this is all an outgrowth of that Tosfos, that the difference between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni is based on tefanos makaros, tefanos bachamamos, so therefore it might not apply to davar gush, where the walls are not used. You have what I mentioned before of Nisan Karelis and Chutz Shani in source 17 mentions that the rice that the Marshal mentions would only be if it's rice that is gush, that is one unit. If it's just very loose rice, then you wouldn't say that. So that is all Kli Rishon and Davar Gush. And the concept of Kli Sheni. But what about, before we get to Kli Sheni, let's talk about in between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni. How do you have in between a Kli Rishon and a Kli Sheni? Irui. Pouring from a Kli Rishon to a Kli Sheni. Meaning, let's say I'm pouring, I open the urn, I open the faucet, boiling hot water is coming down into my cup. So my cup is a Kli Sheni, according to most. There is a chumrah of the Chazon Ish. I didn't see it in the sources here, but there's a chumrah of the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish holds that if there is something that is connected to the Kli Rishon, if the Kli Rishon is still ala Eish, when I pour it into the Kli Sheni. So let's say a regular urn that we all have. You open up the faucet, you open up the berez, and the hot water goes into the cup. You know what the Chazon Ish says? That cup is also called a Kli Rishon because it's connected to the Kli Rishon that's on the fire. Most don't hold that way. Most assume, Ramosha and others assume that no, that's a Kli Sheni. That's a Kli Sheni. The cup is a Kli Sheni. Okay, that's just, keep in mind, we'll get to talk about Kli Sheni soon. But what about Irui? What about if I put, let's say tea is cookable, is not cooked, a tea leaf, anything I put in the bottom of the cup. So I'm going to open up the urn, so that's a Kli Rishon, but before it hits the bottom of the Kli Sheni, it's going to hit my food. So that's not Kli Sheni, because Kli Sheni doesn't cook. That means if you put something into a Kli Sheni, that's already in a Kli Sheni. But here, it's called Iru. You're pouring from the Kli Rishon to the Kli Sheni. It's left the environment of the Kli Rishon. It is does not yet have the coolest of a Kli Sheni. So what is the halacha there? So that is a discussion in the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi seems to say that we are machmer, that it is subject to Bishul. But if you look in Tosfos at Shabbos Tav Mem Beis quotes, not one, not two, but three opinions. Three opinions about the halacha of Irui Kli Rishon, pouring from the Kli Rishon. Rabbeinu Shmuel, Mevi Raya, source 19, De Irui Kli Sheni. Rabbeinu Shmuel holds that Irui is Kli Sheni. Kli Sheni meaning, once it's left the environs of the Kli Rishon, even though it doesn't have the kula of the Tfanos Makaros yet, it's okay, you can still have the kula of a Kli Sheni. Why? Based on a Sugi Psachim, Tata'agvar. Tata'agvar, that's a Yoredea Sugya. If you pour A onto B, does A overpower B or does B overpower A? So the Gemara's maskana is Tata'agvar, the bottom one's temperature is mashpia on the upper ones, Tata'agvar. So Tosfos says, according to Rabbeinu Shmuel, Rabbeinu Shmuel says, you see from the bottom wins. So if you Irui Kli Rishon is called a Kli Sheni because that's the one that is overpowers. That's Rabbeinu Shmuel. Well, the Ri says the opposite. L'ri nira de Irui Kli Rishon. No, Irui is like a Kli Rishon. Baby Raya, there's Gemara in Zvachim. Daf Tzadihei, Tana Rabban, and Shetavu Shalbo. Ein Liela Shabi Shalbo. I only know if you cooked in a Kli Cheres, it has to be destroyed. It had kachim and to prevent nosar. How do I know even if you only poured boiling hot from a Kli Rishon? Tamalomar Asher Tuvu Shalbo Yishaver. Alma to Iri Chashem Avashel. So 2 days, whether Iri Kli Rishon is Kli Rishon or Kli Sheni. How do you have a middle day? How can it be a third day? It's either yes, no. So says the Tosfos. We continue. V'nireh, source 21. De Iri lo avi Kli Rishon v'lo Kli Sheni elam avashel kidei klipa. It cooks the outer layer. So it doesn't cook the whole item. It doesn't cook nothing. So it's in the middle. Irui mevashel kidei klipa. So for Hilchot Shabbos, that shouldn't make a difference. For Yaredeya, for kashrus, okay, you get the inner layer of the food, the first layer. But for Hilchot Shabbos, you can't cook the outer layer either. So for Hilchot Shabbos, Iri Kli Rishon, l'chor, according to this, is Kli Rishon. For regarding Hilchot Shabbos, it's going to be Aser. Mevashel Kidei Klipa. There is a one way that one can, there is a kula Let's say somebody's warming up a baby bottle, right? Sometimes you want to give a baby, take somebody frozen milk, take it out, you put it into a boiling hot cup. So could you do irui on that baby bottle, irui from a Kli Rishon? The answer is yes. Why? Because you're not cooking the outside. Let's say if you have a hard baby bottle, you're not cooking the outside of that. That's the klipa, and inside it's not cooking. So maybe one could be makel regarding that, because then the bavasha the klipa wouldn't apply. I'm not sure if you have the bags. Is that called a klipa? If you have a milk in a bag? Okay, I'm not sure. But either way, this is what the Shulchan Aruch says in Sheini Ches, source 22. Also, litin tavlim b'ka'ara. You're not allowed to put spices, uncooked spices, in a bowl. V'le'aros alein mikli rishon, to pour on them from the Kli Rishon, because that is irui Kli Rishon, that will be mavashal k'dei klipa. Ta'af tavlim, the Mishnah Berurah explains, ein mizbashal b'Kli Sheni b'kamakam ha'iri mikli Rishon kaimalon du mavashal k'dei klipa. Where does this come up? Pouring boiling hot water. Let's say I rinsed my cup out. I wanted to have a clean cup before I put the tea in, before I put that water in. So I'll rinse it out and then I'll go fill it up. I have some drops of cold water in the bottom of the cup. So do I have to do my best to make sure that that's dry? Because the hot water is going to go onto that and be mavashal it. So the Shmir Shabbos says, yeah, you should try to make sure it's dry. Lefichach yesh lahakpid shelo lishpoch mikli rishon al ale te shelo nisbashal al gabe yom. We'll get to that. We'll have a special separate section on making tea. The Shmir Shabbos says, yeah, because iri kli rishon will be mavashal right when it hits. V'chein yesh lahakpid shelo lishpoch mikli rishon al tamsis te kara. If something's cold, or lishpoch tot salachet or kos sheni nekios. Right, Moshe Feinstein also. If this is different, if it's a second cup of tea and then there's some tea left in the bottom, you have to and you give me another cup, you have to make sure that's cleaned out. So that's different. That's more lakula, because there we have ein bishul achar bishul. If it's not totally cold, then for sure it's mutar lachatchila, right? That's the Ramah. And if it's not, it's not in lagamre, which we discussed in the last year. But even if it is, it's different than taking water out of the tap. Water out of the tap that you rinsed with that was never cooked. Here it was already cooked, and me'ikar adin ein bishul achar bishul balach. Therefore, there's a few drops. Rav Rosner says, anyway, a few drops. You're not letting cooking. It's not you're not thinking about it, and it's even less than a chatzi shiur. And other poskim, if you look in the next verse, Rav Mordechai Eliyahu even says it could be a chumra dasli de kula. Because what am I going to do? I'm going to take something and try to wipe out the drops. So then I might end up absorbing some of the drops into the material I'm using to wipe out. I might have to squeeze. The squeeze drops. So it's a chumra dasili kulas. Therefore, if you have just shake the cup, so it's not, you don't have a puddle of water or sitting in there, and that's good enough. That's good enough. You don't have to be so makbid about every single drop. Okay, so that is Kli Rishon and iri Kli Rishon, and now we get to Kli Sheni. So we said before, Kli Sheni is not mavashal. So put anything you want in a Kli Sheni. Not so fast. Not so fast. So first, there is a concept which we're going to have a lot of, B'ez Hashem, in the future shiurim, called mechzi kimavashel. Mechzi kimavashel is, it looks like cooking. So there's going to be a whole world of derabbanans, of hachzara, of mechzi kimavashel. But there is an idea that's quoted in some sources that even putting something into a Kli Sheni, if it's totally cooked, still maybe it looks like cooking. The Mishnah in Shabbos in the 22nd parak, you have it there in source 27, talks about Kol Shabbat. This is the Mishnah that we've had numerous times already about ein bishul achar bishul. Kol Shabbat b'chavan me'erev Shabbos, shor naso b'chavan b'Shabbos. As long as it was cooked before Shabbos, you could cook it on Shabbos. V'chol shelo ba b'chavan me'erev Shabbos, and if it wasn't, madich naso b'chavan b'Shabbos. But if it wasn't cooked before Shabbos, you're allowed to be'mediach it. You can't soak it, but you could sprinkle. You could sprinkle hot water on it. Why would you be allowed to sprinkle? You're talking about something that wasn't cooked yet? So, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a Kli Rishon? Are we talking about a Kli Sheni? Totally not clear. So, Tosfos, in earlier Masechah Shabbos, Daf Lamed Tes, that's the Sugyas of Bishul. So, Tosfos, in source 28, says, if you say like the Rashbam that we saw before, the Rabbeinu Shmuel was the Rashbam that we saw before, if you say Iri is Kli Sheni, then there's no problem here. Something that was not cooked, but if you're sprinkling hot water on it, it's not a problem. But we don't paskin that way. Remember, we paskin mivasho kedei klipa. That you should be careful about it. So according to Rabbeinu Tam, that Iri is Kli Rishon, that's the worst, that's the most chamor. So then you have to say that you're sprinkling it from a Kli Sheni. So why would sprinkling be okay and not putting it in directly if the Kli Sheni is not mavashel anyway? So that is what Tosfos says, mechzi kimavashel. If you put something into a Kli Sheni, people might not know, Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, it looks like cooking, and therefore it would be a problem. And the Maggid Avraham quotes this idea about soaking things in a kli sheni, demersi kimavashel, and the Aruch Shabbos as well quotes this chumrah. If it is nikar that you're not putting something in to cook it, but for flavoring, let's say making tea or making something else, so then it's not a problem. It doesn't mersi kimavashel. People know that you're not putting this in to cook it. The whole thing is a chumrah d'Rabbanan. So, that's the Aruch Shabbos says, this is not as lamaisa as the next piece that we're going to see is going to be. The Kalei Tal is not even so convinced that we should paskin like that day of Tosfos. There's another day of Tosfos there, not about Mexican Mavashel. So therefore, maybe we should go on to the other exception. So this was exception number one. Kli sheni is not Mavashel, but if it looks like cooking, maybe it should be a Mavashel. But now we get to the world known as Kalei Bishul. Kalei Bishul, things that cook easily. Let's get into that sugya right now. Kalei Bishul starts with that Mishnah that we have already seen that says there is no Bishul achar Bishul kol Shabbat b'chamin me'erev Shabbos shown also back in source 27. But the Mishnah ends off by saying, but there's an exception to the rule. There's an exception to the rule. The Mishnah said if it was not cooked before Shabbos, you're allowed to sprinkle on it on Shabbos, except for maliach hayashan vidagim meluchim ketanim v'kul yisis pilanin. These types of fish. Shahadachasan zuhi gemar malachtan. Their sprinkling on them is their gemar malacha. What does that mean, gemar malacha? Rashi. Now we get to source 33 on page 39. Says Rashi, shezeu gemar malachtan v'havi bishul. This is their cooking. What do we learn from that Mishnah? There are some things that cook easier, in an easier way than other things. And that is also quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, Sheini Chesef Dalet, even though the Shulchan Aruch quotes, Ein Bishul B'Kli Sheini, right? That was, we know, based on the Gemara. But V'mu Davar Yavish Lo Nizbashal Lefnei Shabbos, Ein Shorna So B'Chamim Shabbos V'Medichin, except for these items, She Einam Tzrichen Bishul Ela Ma'at, V'Atachasin U'Gemar Malachtan. So what exactly does that mean? Like what? And it's an issa d'araisa. The Gemara says you're chayav achatas. It's an issa d'araisa to cook things that are kalei bishul. The question is, what are kalei bishul? How do you define them? The Gemara has discussions about melach, about salt. Could you put salt on something that is in a kli sheni or even in a kli rishon? Maybe the Gemara has 2 days there, Shabbos, Tav Mem Beis, whether salt is very easily cooked or very not easily cooked. The Shulchan Aruch says it's very not easily cooked, and therefore it's mutter. Melach mutter liti letocho, says the Shulchan Aruch in 37. Kivan she'avir me'al eish. Once it's off the fire, you can put the salt in, because salt needs cooking like a piece of steak. It needs a lot of cooking, so doing this wouldn't be so effective. V'yesh osrim, there are maz machmir to put melach even to a kli sheni if it's yaso ledisbo. Lamaisa, it's very hard to know what's Kalei Bishul, what's not Kalei Bishul. What do we know? Kli Rishon is Mavashal. Kli Sheni is not Mavashal, but it is Mavashal Kalei Bishul. So what are Kalei Bishul? We know certain things that are not Kalei Bishul. Water, based on the Gemara, maybe salt, but everything else, the Yereim. Rabbi Lazari Metz. Rabbi Lazari Metz in source 39, he says, we don't know. We're not sure. He says, Ein Bishul Tali, lo b'kli Rishon v'lo b'kli Sheni. Ach lefishu davar hamizbashel pa'amim shu davar achu mizbashel abakli sheni. Some things are soft and they cook even in a kli sheni. V'yesh davar kasha shavilu b'kli rishon in mizbashel, and some don't cook in a kli rishon once it's off the fire. V'yesh davar mizbashel b'kli shon v'lo b'kli sheni. So some cook in a kli rishon, not in a kli sheni. Hilkach, says the Yereim, Blazmi Metz. Yizar adam shalo lahachnis b'Shabbos shum davar b'kli sheni. Better lamaisa not to put anything into a kli sheni. V'yaf b'kli shlishi shayatzo ledisbo. Or even in a kli shlishi, he mentions explicitly, as long as it's yatzo ledisbo, she'ein anu b'kiyim b'dvarim rachim v'kashim. We don't know. Miyu misbasho b'kli sheni u'mishu sheini misbasho. We don't know. The Yerei and Paskins L'chumra don't put anything into a kli sheni unless you know Vade for sure, and the Ramah Paskins that way. The Ramah says, "V'uadin l'chol davar kasha sheini roy lechol klabel shriya also l'shroso to have a gemar malacha, even in a kli sheni." The Mishnah Berurah says, according to this chumra, this would be a blanket chumra, and that's what the Shmir Shabbos also paskins in source 42. There are things that cook even in a kli sheni. We don't know what they are. There's an Isser Bishul, even putting it into a sheni, if it's still Yad Soledispo. If it's still Yad Soledispo, the Chazon Ish here has a kula. He says, I don't know what you have to be so machmer for. You don't know anything. The Gemara has specific cases of Kalei Bishul. Right? Rove things in the world are not Kalei Bishul. The Gemara, the Mishnah, has a few examples of Kalei Bishul. How can you say, we don't know, so everything's going to be off limits? The Chazon Ish says, no. Ein lachmer akpapas, bread, other soft things, or maybe like an egg, but this is known as the chumrah of the Yereim, and that's why many have the practice. Rav Moshe writes this, has a practice of not putting anything into a sheni because just for this Yereim we don't know what's Kalei Bishul. So what about a shlishi? So we've spoken about Kli Rishon, Irui Kli Rishon. What about sheni? And what about Kli Shlishi? What about Kli Shlishi? So, the Yereim, if you remember, mentioned, well, if it's Yad Soledispo, I'm not even going to put it into a Kli Shlishi. You should be careful. So the Pri Megadim there says, look in the Shulchan Aruch. When the Shulchan Aruch quoted that Yereim, he did not quote the Kli Shlishi line. Did not quote the Kli Shlishi line. That's what the Pri Megadim writes in source 45 in the Eshel Avram. Pri Megadim says that though the Yereim says even in a Kli Shlishi, he assumes from the language of the Shulchan Aruch that would only be by a Kli Sheni. L'man damar b'sif hei doser pas b'Kli Sheni ha Kli Shlishi in a Kli Shlishi shema'ara sanim mimayim tmunim Kli Sheni umisham lakaras katanim yesh lahakel. That would be Mekel, and that's what the Mishnah Berurah also writes. So there are a number of poskim that say Kli Sheni is the most that you'll get, not a Kli Shlishi. Kli Shlishi for sure is okay. The Chazon Ish doesn't think so. The Chazon Ish assumes there's no difference. You know why the poskim don't talk about a Kli Shlishi? Because there's no difference between a Kli Sheni and a Kli Shlishi. It says the Chazon Ish in Orach Chaim, Siman Nun Beis, there in source 46. Ula inyan Kli Shlishi. B'makam shekli Sheni aser kagon pas o betzalim ladas achron ma'amirim. Because the Mishnah Berurah Pri Megadim is adil hakel. The Pri Megadim is meko by a Kli Shlishi. Says the Chazon Ish. I don't know why. V'lo matzinu makor lechalek bein sheni l'shlishi. I don't know what this svar is. The Gemara says Kli Sheni is not mavashal, but Kalei Bishul it is. So maybe Kli Shlishi too. V'im dvar misbashlim b'sheni misbashlim b'shlishi. V'ena davar tali ela b'cham hamayim. Shiu chamim shayas oledispo. You know why it's not discussed? Because it's for sure l'chumra. There's no difference between Kli Sheni and Kli Shlishi. Ramosha Feinstein, this is one of those psukim that shook the world, that much of the world is so mechan. Ramosha says, you know why it's not written anywhere? Because it's for sure lakula. For sure lakula. Kalei Bishul might cook in a Kli Sheni, but a Kli Shlishi, even if it's boiling hot, Kli Shlishi is for sure not mavashal. Says Ramosha in Orach Chaim Chelik Dalet, Siman Ayin Dalet. Lani is daiti. This is the tshuva written to Rabbi Eider. L'daiti lo nira klal omar dika dvar mishus vashal b'Kli Shlishi. I don't think so. I don't think things will cook in a Kli Shlishi. Delo matzinu el sheb l'Kli Sheni yesh dvar hamispashlim. Umemela me'achar she'en anu yodim yesh lesser kol davar Kli Sheni. You got the chumrah of the Yereim because you don't know better. Ubekli Shlishi lo matzinu. This is Rav Moshe. This is Rav Ovadia, and this is many hold Kli Shlishi. Do whatever you want. Kli Sheni, you're not sure, so be machmir. Kli Shlishi, do whatever you want. And this is what the Aruch HaShabbos summarizes, and other Lamaisa poskim summarize what to do. What to do? Mutter os memhe, you have it there in source 48. Mutter lo yideh chalav mafustar, you have pasteurized milk into a Kli Sheni, right? Because that is already cooked. That's pasteurized. Bishul. Avkat kafe names. What about coffee? Beklishin is bashal b'shas yitzur b'Kli Sheni. If it's already processed, put into a Kli Sheni. V'yesh omrim. Some say just put into a Kli Shlishi. Rav Moshe says that's what his practice always is. Put everything in a Kli Shlishi. You don't have to get confused. What is this Kalei Bishul? Is this one of the exceptions to the rule? Just put everything into a Kli Shlishi, and you rely on Rav Moshe and Rav Avadia in that way. The Pnini Halacha discusses what about making what's called a manach chama, one of those soups. So again, the noodles in there, like a noodle soup, the noodles in there are already pre-cooked and they're just dehydrated. The water's taken out. And what about those vegetables? Most of the time they're also just dehydrated. The spices, the poskim say, might not have been cooked. But Lamaisa, use a Kli Shlishi. Use a Kli Shlishi, so then l'chora it is okay. Anyway, no matter what. If it's not a soup, but it's like a puree, like it's going to end up being mashed potatoes or couscous, that's more of a problem. because that's lisha. That's not our malacha now, but that would be kneading with a K. But the Pnei Halacha of Malamed says in 49, Ava kli shlishi ena mavashel. Lefichach muter lachin manach hamashel marak oshel orez al yedei sheyiru mayim chamem mikli sheni. You pour it in. Iri kli sheni is like a kli shlishi. Over. That's what the poskim seem to say. Iri kli rishon, that's a machlokas, what it is. Iri kli shlishi, iri kli sheni into a kli shlishi, l'chara, that's like a kli shlishi. Ve'ich shash be'iri mi kli sheni, hova lo yadua shehamana hachama mikali bishul, and therefore that would be okay, and that's what the quotes in OU Kashrus halacha statement. The Mishnah Berurah permissible to place bread in a kli shlishi, v'chulu. Just one must make sure that it is things are cooked. So a couple of applications. Maybe we'll talk about. We have to talk about again in the future shiurim other elements of bishul. Bishul acharafia. But interesting. I don't know if we're going to discuss it here, so I'll just mention it now before I forget. What about a ladle? What about a ladle? Like your bowl on Shabbos. Is that a kli sheni or a kli shlishi? So it's going from the pot to the ladle to your bowl. Is the ladle called a separate kli? It goes into the pot of kli rishon. So that's a machlokas haposkim. Some say that early achronim, right? The Matzeket, the Taz, and the Marshal discussed this 500 years ago. Some say that's called the ladle's a kli rishon. It goes into the kli rishon pot. It gets hot, and then you put it into the bowl. It's a kli sheni. That's a big chumrah. Or do you say no? Do you say that the ladle is a kli sheni? It wasn't on the fire, right? And therefore the ladle is kli sheni, the bowl is a kli shlishi. So there's a machlok, there's a stira in the Mishnah Berurah. It seems to be two different netios, but the Minchas Yitzchak and the Tzurba writes maybe it's a sveika dedina. So regarding the ladle itself, we'll treat it like a kli sheni. But because it's Rishon or Sheini, we'll treat it like a kli Rishon. We'll be machmir for the ladle because the question is Rishon or Sheini, Rishon. But regarding the sveika dedina, regarding whether the bowl is a Sheini or shlishi, we'll be makel by the bowl. We'll consider the ladle a kli rishon maybe because it goes in, but regarding the bowl, we'll call it kli shlishi. So, however, that seems to be the minhag that we treat the bowl as a kli shlishi, and therefore you can do whatever you want, put matzah into the bowl, and the like, if you rely on the kli shlishi heter. What about making tea on Shabbos? Making tea on Shabbos lamaisa, so using everything that we have discussed. So the Aruch HaShulchan does not believe in kli shlishi. Does not believe in the heter of kli shlishi. So the Aruch HaShulchan says it's a problem because people make tea. And even if they use a kli shlishi, says the Aruch HaShulchan is not mutter. Source 51. Zaha'esiv shekarentei shema'aran aleim chamin v'davar yadua shebishulan kal. Right, it's easily cooked. V'afilu b'kli sheni misbashlin kamoshenin aroas. Look, it becomes dark. So you see, it's being cooked. So therefore, it's for sure a problem. V'rabim nechshalim bazeh b'taino shel hevel. And people are mako and they're mistaken. I think you're cooking the tea, and therefore the Aruch HaShulchan says it's a problem. We're prashing in a rosh is bashlam kli sheni. You see, it's cooked in kli shlishi shebishulan kal. Ramosha Feinstein says, I don't understand. You see it? Why? Because it gets colored. Getting colored has nothing to do with cooking. Even iced tea gets colored, says Rav Moshe. So I don't understand the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan is saying, like towards the end of the piece of Rav Moshe, in source 52, Umasharoan anu beinenu, that which we see with our eyes, Shem misadmin hamayin, the water's getting red, is the Eino Inyan Bishul. Daf bikarim mamish, even cold, misadmin b'meshach zman. So he's not sure what the Aruch HaShulchan means by that, but Rav Moshe says, anyway, I think kli shlishi is okay. I think kli shlishi is okay, and therefore make tea in a kli shlishi. Put the tea bag in a kli shlishi, says Rav Moshe. Put it in a kli shlishi. Rav Malamed also, Rabbi Shalom Rosner, put the tea bag in a kli shlishi. The Mishnah Berurah seems to be machmir, lechatchila for sure, and he says, and this is what many do also, to make tea essence before Shabbos. The best, according to the Mishnah Berurah, is to make the essence, put the tea in boiling hot water before Shabbos, then leave that hot water on the blech, and then just add that, because then it's ein bishul achar bishul by lach if it's not nistanin legamre. So some say to do that. Some say at least to make the tea essence, because the tea essence at least is ein bishul achar bishul, while the tea bags would be not mavushal at all. So this is it seems like kli shlishi is a safe way to go. Rav Shechter quotes from Rav Soloveitchik, who quoted Rav his grandfather, that they didn't think tea were kalei bishul at all, and therefore they just put tea. They didn't need a kli shlishi, right? That's what he quotes in the Nefesh Harav. You have it on page 56. Mishnah Berurah about tea. Rabbeinu Amar Bazeh Alashon Sasa b'shalosh medaktik b'mitzvahs. His grandfather Reb Chaim was also a medaktik b'mitzvahs. Vayemishtamesh b'sakiotei b'kli sheni. V'yafu aynoeg achar of lahakel bazeh gamkein. Then what could be make? Good. One or two other issues that come up in the sugya of Bishul. Again, this is all within Bishul Daraisa. We didn't get to Bishul Darabanan yet. The future shiurim would be about Bishul Darabanan, the three sugyas of Shehiyah, Hachazara, and Hatmana. This is still Bishul Daraisa. We've spoken so far about Yad Soledisbo as being the shiur. The Chai Adam came up with a new phrase in Hilchot Shabbos. Yad Nichvesbo. Scalded. Even hotter than Yad Soledisbo. The Chai Adam says, if something is Yad Nichvesbo, then for sure it cooks sheni, shlishi, anything. Yad Nichvesbo. The Chai Adam gets this from a Mishnah in Maisros and the Rambam in Hilchas Meiser. We know that to be, if I go out to a field and pick something, pick an apple and eat it there's no chiyuv of Maisros yet. That's called achila sarai. That's called snacking. But once I bring it into my house and then I make it into a pile and I smooth out the pile, that's called meruach. So then you're chayiv in Maisros. But there are certain events that are koveil Maisros even before you bring it into the house. Shabbos is koveil Maisros. Mekach, selling it, and Bishul. Bishul is Kovela Maisros. What type of cooking? So that's what the Rambam says. That's what the Rambam uses the lashon of Yan Nichvesbo. The Rambam in Hilchos Meiser in source 58. V'im hayacham, talking about if it's cooked in a sheni, that's not called Bishul for Hilchos Meisers. V'im hayacham biyoser kadesha yichves hayad. If it's very hot that it burns the hand, then lo yitin latocho. That's mavashal. So you see from Hilchos Meisers, there's a concept called Yan Nichvesbo. So the Chai Adam borrows that from Hilchos Meiseris and says it's the same thing in Hilchos Shabbos. Same thing in Hilchos Shabbos, Yad Nichvesbo. The Chazon Ish says that this is based on Yerushalmi. So first of all, maybe the Bavli argues on the Yerushalmi. The Bavli would never have such a lashon in this context. And number two, even if it's not a machlokes, who says that applies in Hilchos Shabbos? Maybe it's only a halacha in Hilchos Meiser. And therefore the Chazon Ish does not think that we pass in this way, though he says it's hard to be makel in Hilchos Shabbos in this regard. Mikol Makom, the Chazon Ish says in source 60, Kashal lahakal b'Isur Shabbos. You can't even use a klisheni if it's yad nichvesbo for anything. Rav Avadia says there is no need to be machmer like this Chai Adam, and therefore you could put cold milk, which is not kali bishul, cold milk into a klisheni, even when it's hot enough to scald the hand. Says the Rav Avadia and Yabia Omer, nearly alacha lamaisa lahaki alitin chalav karlato kes kafe. Afapi shayasoledes v'nichves mimene. So that's Yad Nichvesbo. One more important sugya regarding Bishul, and that's Magus. Magus is stirring. So we know stirring is part of the Bishul process. The Gemara Maseches Beitza Daf Lamed Daled, source number 62, on page 54. This Gemara says, if somebody brings the fire and somebody brings the matches and somebody stirs, that's all part of the Bishul process, and one can be chayef for Bishul da'araisa. Why is that? Why is stirring part of the Bishul da'araisa? Because let's say if I have something that is not fully cooked yet, and I stir it on the fire, so then I'm moving items around in the pot. Stuff that was a little further from the fire gets a little closer to the fire. Makarev bishulo. That's also something that's Bishul on Shabbos. That's Bishul on Shabbos. If I move something closer to the fire that was further from the fire, that's even though it would have cooked in a certain amount of time, I move it closer. That's Bishul. If something is not fully cooked and I put a cover on it so the temperature goes up, anything that's Makari Bishulo is aser. So Pashtus Magus is an example of Makari Bishulo. I stir it, it doesn't get burned, it cooks better. And the Gemara in Shabbos is also mashma that Magus is an Isser da'araisa. So that applies when something is not fully cooked, I stir it, I'm going to be chayav da'araisa. Then came the kolbo. Kolbo, one of the Rishonim, the Kolbo says something that we don't fully understand, but we're machmer like the Kolbo. Even though lachadchila, even though we don't fully understand it, even the Mishnah Berurah says, I'm not sure why this is. The Kolbo says that one shouldn't stir something that even if it's fully cooked. So there's no Bishul daraisa. Remember we said Machlokas Rambam Rashba about Bishul. The Rashba says up until Machlo ben Jusai. After that there's no more Bishul daraisa. We're Machlo like the Rambam. Up until Mavushal Kol Tzarcho is Bishul daraisa. But after Mavushal Kol Tzarcho, so there's no more Bishul daraisa. The Kolbo says you should not stir something that's Mavushal Kol Tzarcho while it's on the fire. That's the Chumrah of the Kolbo. The Kaimalon source 65. The Megis Chayev Mishum Mavashal Afilu Bekder Mavusheles Kozban Shehi Ala Eish. Why? The Pri Megadim says stirring does something super, even more than cooking. The Mishnah Berurah in the Sharatzian says, I don't understand. It's fully cooked. You can't do better than cooking. Hagasa, which is a form of cooking, you can't do better than cooking. The Mishnah Berurah in the Sharatzian says, V'lo Eida Hatam. How is this better? You can't be mevashal something that's fully cooked. There's no bishul daraisa when it's fully cooked. For sure, it's not aser b'diavad. If somebody did this, it's not going to aser the food because we don't fully understand this. But this is the chumrah of the kolbo. Why? Where did it come from? Probably because maybe he's nervous that there are some pieces that are not fully cooked. You think the cholent is fully cooked. Maybe it's not. And if you stir it, you're going to violate. Lamaisa, we're machmer like the kolbo l'chadchila. And therefore, let's say I want to stir the cholent. I want to make sure it doesn't stick. It's fully cooked. So I shouldn't stir it while it is in the crock pot. I should take it out. We're going to learn about all the ways that you have to take it out and put it back in. It's got to be a covered fire. It's got to be... So with all of that, l'chadchila, I should set up a system where I'm able to take it out and then stir it and then put it back in. What if I don't want to stir it? I just want to take some out. I want to ladle some out. It's Friday night. I want to have a little cholent. Do I have to take the whole thing out and then put it and then take it out and then put it back in? The answer is yes, l'chadchila. Yes, l'chadchila, because of this kolbo. Not just stirring, because when you ladle something, then everything moves around and takes the place of the other food that it was around, and that's like a form of stirring. Ladling. So that's for the Rambam. The Rambam says in Hilchot Shabbos, Perek Gimel Halacha Yud Aleph 69, Asur l'hachlas b'akriva l'kadeir b'Shabbos. Ala eish l'hotzi mena b'Shabbos eshem megas v'zeh mitzarchi Bishul. If something is not fully cooked, you can't stick a ladle in there. That's part of Bishul. And the Ravid argues, but the Shulchan Aruch says, passing like the Rambam, that if something is not mavushal kol tzarcho, this is not the kolbo. This is not mavushal kol tzarcho. If lo mizvav kol tzarcho, ein motziin b'kaf mehem. But b'nei megas, that's a form of megas of stirring. V'ika mishum mavashel. And the Rama adds that even where the food is removed from the fire, even if it's off the fire, one shouldn't take it with a spoon. Mr. Brewer says that the Ramah means that one shouldn't spoon out the contents of the pot, but pour it out directly. Pour the whole thing out. The Mr. Brewer says that the Haskamas HaPoskim is not like the Ramah. We don't have to go that far in the Chumrah. Right? That just means take it off the fire. Take it off the fire, the Mr. Brewer says. You don't have to go so far. There's a Chumrah, Gabi Chumrah of the Ramah. But just megas, and therefore not to stir it while it is on the fire and not to ladle it out while it is on the fire. And that's why the Orcha Shabbos says in 75, Ein lahotzi b'kaf tafshel mikadera ha'omedes ala eish. You shouldn't take it out. Take it out with a ladle. Bishum hotzazu ma'areves as a tafshel, because it gets mixed around. V'hainu af kasher tafshel mavushel kol tzarcho. Even if it is fully cooked, that is the chumrah of the kolbo. I might add that it's not just stirring and not just ladling out. Some poskim say even, let's say I want to take the cover off. I want to take the cover off and just look how it's doing. Or somebody wants to describe to me a cholent facial. I'm not going to eat the cholent right now, but I just want to put my face over it and breathe in. That's Oneg Shabbos. So according to this, it could be that also shouldn't be done because putting the cover back on is helping the bishul process. So you should take it off, then take the cover off, cholent facial, put the cover back on, and then put it back on. Anything while it's on the fire, we shouldn't do it. Sometimes it's impossible. What if it's a very heavy pot and we're going to learn about the details of taking it off and holding it and kavana? What if you can't do it? So Rav Avadia says, if there's a makom tzarech that you can't do it, then as long as it's fully cooked, you can ladle it out. The whole thing is a chumrah, and if you're not stirring, you're just stirring memela because you're ladling it out. So Rav Avadia says in the Chazon Avadia, that would be okay if need be. Mutar lahachnas batzeches okav likderis hatafshel b'Shabbos mavushal kol tzarcho, to take it out. Kishes tzarech, when there's a tzarech to leave the pot on the fire. Good. The other couple of other issues. What about, is it only with a spoon? What about just taking a fork and I want to take out a potato? Is that called stirring? So in the Chut HaShari of Rissa Karela, it talks about maybe one can be makel there because you're not even stirring, unless you say stirring means something, part of the food is going to take the spot of where the food was, and therefore even taking a fork and taking out a potato, all the food is going to go where that spot was. So it could be that would be usher as well. Others say also if it's liquid, if it's all liquid, maybe there's no issue because it's all moving around as it is. Maybe this only applies to solids, not to liquids. Okay, but either way, this is stirring. So we discussed a lot today. We discussed Kli Rishon, Iri Kli Rishon, Kli Sheini, Kli Shlishi, Davar Gush, stirring, making tea, Yanichves Bo. A lot going on here in the second shiur regarding Bishul. Again, Tzurba Hilchot Shabbat Program, volume number 18. We had a haskalah. Okay, we'll stop here.